The frozen earth shook as artillery shells screamed through the December dawn over Monschau, Germany. December 16, 1944, early morning, and something was terribly, impossibly wrong with the pattern of fire. The shells weren't hitting the ground or exploding into the trees like soldiers expected. Instead, they detonated high above the German positions, far overhead, creating a deadly cascade of steel fragments raining down. No foxhole could save them from this. The 326th Volksgrenadier Division, attacking the 38th Cavalry Squadrons, discovered that years of fighting on the Eastern Front had taught them nothing about what they faced now. This wasn't the artillery they understood. The predictable impacts, the safe zones behind entrenchments, the protective value of digging in, none of it worked anymore. This was death arriving with mathematical precision from above. At that exact moment, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson, commanding the 406th Artillery Group, had just made one of the most critical unauthorized decisions of the entire Bulge campaign. Without permission from above, he had ordered his gunners to load something forbidden: shells fitted with proximity fuses. These remarkable devices contained miniature radar systems that measured their distance from targets and detonated at the perfect height, multiplying artillery lethality by 50 times over. The mathematics of destruction were about to transform in these frozen Ardennes forests. What the German soldiers couldn't possibly know was that they'd just encountered a weapon so revolutionary it would reshape warfare itself. The storm had been unleashed. Operation Watch im Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, had begun, though not how the Germans had planned. Hitler's final gamble had mobilized 200,000 soldiers, 1,000 tanks, and nearly 2,000 artillery pieces, all concealed through fog and secrecy in the Ardennes. The Führer had promised his generals this offensive would split the Allied armies and recapture Antwerp, reversing a war spiraling towards certain defeat. The initial bombardment at 05:30 hours on December 16th achieved complete surprise. German artillery unleashed fire at 1,600 rounds per minute along an 85-mile front. American intelligence had failed spectacularly. The massive build-up had gone undetected, and many frontline units were either fresh replacements or exhausted soldiers sent here for rest. Yet at Monschau, Colonel Axelson confronted an impossible situation. The 38th Cavalry Squadron, a small reconnaissance unit, was being crushed by overwhelming German numbers. Normal artillery couldn't stop this assault. Desperate measures demanded a desperate choice. Axelson made his historic decision: unleash the secret proximity-fused shells despite explicit orders against it. He risked court-martial for this choice, but he understood something crucial: following orders meant losing this battle. The results were immediate and catastrophic for the Germans. Advancing soldiers in traditional assault waves suddenly encountered fire like nothing in their experience. The shells burst 30 to 50 feet above them, each explosion spraying fragments across a vast area far beyond what conventional ground-burst shells could achieve. Veteran soldiers who'd mastered taking cover from ordinary artillery fell where they hid: behind trees, in foxholes, in ditches. The secret science of death had arrived. These proximity fuses represented American scientific brilliance and industrial might at their absolute pinnacle. Unlike conventional shells requiring direct impact or timed fuses, often detonating at wrong moments, the proximity fuse contained a self-contained radar system barely larger than a coffee can. American engineers had somehow packed 130 electronic components into this tiny space, 4 or 5 miniature vacuum tubes depending on the model, that survived the crushing force of 20,000 times gravity during firing. When the gun fired, acceleration shattered a glass ampule containing electrolyte, creating a battery that powered the microscopic radar throughout the shell's flight. Dr. Merle Tuve at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory had driven this impossible development with the intensity of the Manhattan Project itself. His laboratory, disguised as an abandoned used car dealership in Silver Spring, Maryland, employed 3% of all American physicists at peak operations. Security matched the atomic bomb program exactly. Workers couldn't even mention their work to families. Each fuse carried a unique serial number for tracking. The technical problems seemed unsolvable. Vacuum tubes designed for home radios needed complete redesign to withstand cannon fire. They had to function while spinning at extreme speeds, operate in any weather, and remain sensitive enough to detect targets without premature detonation. The breakthrough came through miniaturization techniques that would later transform the electronics industry. Dr. James Van Allen created tubes no larger than pencil erasers, yet containing all elements of conventional radio tubes. By December 1944, American factories produced 40,000 proximity fuses daily. Over 100 companies participated: RCA, General Electric, Sylvania, Crossley Corporation, and countless others. The program cost $1 billion 1940s dollars, second only to the Manhattan Project in wartime spending. Axelson's unauthorized use on December 16th created an immediate command crisis. He'd violated direct orders restricting proximity fuses to anti-aircraft use, orders designed to prevent captured examples reaching German hands. But the devastating results at Monchaux were undeniable. The German attack had stopped completely, with casualties shocking everyone. News of this new weapon's power reached Supreme Headquarters rapidly. General Eisenhower, watching disaster unfold across the entire Ardennes, formally requested authorization on December 19th. By December 21st, all restrictions disappeared, and proximity fuses were released for general ground combat throughout the Bulge. The rapid distribution that followed showcased American logistical superiority. Within days, shells with these fuses reached artillery units across the Ardennes. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion at Bastogne received their allocation as the German ring tightened around the town. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion, manning M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers, began using them defending the northwest. The 969th Artillery Battalion, an African-American unit under Lieutenant Colonel Hubert D. Barnes, employed them with devastating effect southwest of Bastogne. Each unit learned the same truth: proximity fuses transformed artillery from support into a decisive weapon. Forward observers no longer needed careful fire adjustment. The fuses found their own perfect detonation point. Accuracy requirements dropped while destructive power increased exponentially. The siege of Bastogne demonstrated proximity fuses in defensive warfare perfectly. The 101st Airborne Division, completely surrounded and outnumbered, held the vital crossroads against repeated assaults. Their artillery included the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, equipped with 75mm pack howitzers, firing proximity-fused shells. Between December 19th and 31st, the 463rd fired exactly 7,676 rounds. Not all carried proximity fuses due to limited supply, but those that did produced devastating effects. German assault formations simply collapsed under airburst barrages, entire platoons eliminated in seconds. The December 22nd attack, following General McAuliffe's famous nuts reply to German surrender demands, showcased this weapon's power perfectly. German infantry advancing across snow-covered fields in traditional formations were caught exposed. Proximity-fused shells detonated overhead with precise timing, creating overlapping destruction with no safe zones. The 969th Artillery Battalion, an all-African-American unit, played equally crucial roles. Their 155mm howitzers created a ring of death around Bastogne's perimeter that proved impenetrable. The larger shells detonating at 50 feet scattered fragments across enormous areas. German prisoners reported later that attacking units lost cohesion before reaching American lines, soldiers fleeing these incomprehensible airbursts. Perhaps the most thoroughly documented demonstration occurred at the Sauer River near Echternach on December 25-26. General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was driving north to relieve Bastogne, personally witnessed this and recorded it in his memoir, War as I Knew It. A German battalion attempting to cross the partially frozen river believed darkness and fog hid them from American observers. Conventional artillery would have needed careful fire adjustment, giving Germans time to complete crossing or find cover. But proximity-fused shells needed no adjustment. Patton wrote simply, "We caught a German battalion crossing the Sauer. The new proximity ammunition was devastating. The shells burst in the air above them. They had nowhere to run. The river behind them, our fire in front and above. When the firing stopped, we counted 702 bodies." This precise casualty count represents one of the few exactly documented figures from proximity fuse employment. A single battalion essentially vanished in minutes. The Ardennes' dense forests, which Germans relied on for concealment, became death traps with proximity fuses. In open terrain, shells detonating at 30 to 50 feet were deadly enough. But in forests, effects multiplied dramatically. Air bursts shattered tree branches, creating thousands of wooden projectiles. Splinters, some long as a man's arm, traveled at hundreds of feet per second with lethal force. Traditional defensive positions, cover behind large trees, foxholes under root systems, became useless. Fragments and splinters came from above, negating centuries of forest fighting wisdom. American gunners quickly recognized this multiplier effect. A single 155mm proximity-fused shell detonating above the forest canopy could clear an area the size of a tennis court of everything living. Metal fragments combined with wooden splinters created a 360-degree kill zone no tactical skill could escape. German units trained in forest warfare found their expertise worthless. Spreading out to minimize casualties made units vulnerable to wide-area effects. Bunching for mutual support meant entire squads died from single shells. There was no correct tactical response to this new threat. Each fuse contained a tiny radio transmitter operating at 180 to 220 MHz, continuously sending waves that reflected off objects: ground, trees, vehicles, bodies. As the shell approached targets, reflected signals strengthened. At predetermined intensity corresponding to optimal burst height, an electronic switch triggered detonation. This entire system functioned under conditions destroying normal electronics. During firing, acceleration reached 20,000 times Earth's gravity. Rotational speeds created massive centrifugal forces. Temperatures ranged from 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit in the gun barrel to sub-zero conditions at trajectory peaks. Yet delicate vacuum tubes protected by innovative cushioning survived with over 80% reliability. Testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground determined optimal burst heights. For 105mm howitzers, the standard divisional piece, 30 feet, proved ideal. The 155mm guns achieved maximum lethality at 50 feet. Rare 240mm shells created devastating effects at 70+ feet, clearing entire grid squares. This technological superiority translated directly into battlefield dominance. Studies showed proximity fuses increased lethality 5 to 10 times over conventional shells. Lethal fragment areas increased by a factor of 50. Anti-aircraft applications showed even more dramatic improvements. Shooting down V-1 flying bombs improved from 17% to 79% success within weeks. The German intelligence failure regarding proximity fuses proved catastrophic. In December 1944, Wehrmacht forces overran an American ammunition depot, capturing approximately 20,000 proximity-fused shells. This intelligence windfall should have sparked immediate countermeasure development. Instead, German technical experts examined the captured fuses and declared them impossible. The presence of vacuum tubes in artillery shells contradicted everything German engineers believed about electronics and ballistics. They concluded Americans used magnetic detection, or the visible components were decoys hiding the real mechanism. This failure stemmed from institutional blindness. Germany had actually led proximity fuse development before the war. Rheinmetall Borsig and AEG Berlin had working prototypes by 1940. But Hitler's order cancelling all weapons requiring more than 6 months production had terminated the program. German engineers couldn't believe Americans had solved problems they themselves had abandoned. The contradictions became even starker when examining what Germany had actually accomplished in their laboratories. Their electrostatic proximity fuses demonstrated remarkable reliability, achieving around 95% success rates through tests using electrical capacitance shifts rather than depending on radar technology. If German scientists had been given the time and resources to continue their work, they might well have introduced proximity fuses into active service by 1941. Hermann Göring himself would confess during his post-war interrogation that German proximity fuses sat mere months away from mass production when the fighting stopped. Then came the Christmas catastrophe. When December 25, 1944 arrived, German soldiers received no holiday reprieve from the bombardment. German commanders had planned to use Christmas for repair work, restocking supplies, and regrouping their scattered units. They discovered instead that proximity fuses operated without regard for calendars or ceasefires. Fuel depots, ammunition trains, gathering points where soldiers huddled together, all erupted under a hail of shells that required not a single forward observer to guide them. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion fired more than 1,000 rounds that single day, and nearly all of them contained proximity fuses. The M7 Priest, self-propelled howitzers, unleashed torrents of accurate fire that caught German soldiers completely off guard. Suddenly, American artillery was no longer restricted to daylight hours. Weather that once provided sanctuary now offered nothing. Darkness brought no safety. Rain and snow ceased to be protective cover. Artillery had transformed into a relentless, around-the-clock menace. The psychological devastation proved overwhelming. German troops had learned to move during foul conditions when Allied planes stayed grounded and American spotters saw nothing. The proximity fuse shattered that survival strategy. Shells arrived without warning, without observation, detonating overhead with lethal precision. Death waited in every moment, behind every cloud, beneath every snowflake. On December 21st, SS Colonel Otto Skorzenis' elite commandos launched their assault on Malmedy. These were not ordinary soldiers, but hand-picked troops who had executed dangerous special operations before, rescuing Mussolini from captivity, nearly seizing the Yugoslav leader Josip Tito, and infiltrating American positions, wearing stolen American uniforms and driving captured American jeeps. Germany had selected its absolute best for this mission. They emerged from the trees wearing American khaki and driving American vehicles. Proximity-fused shells detonated overhead with terrifying accuracy. The American uniforms that should have protected them became death traps. Shrapnel rained down with such precision it seemed the shells possessed intelligence, as though they could somehow sense the deception. The actual casualty figures remained disputed afterward, but the outcome proved absolutely decisive. The attack collapsed into chaos with devastating losses that effectively ended Skorzenis' offensive capability. What shocked observers most was the reaction among the elite SS troops themselves. These soldiers had been indoctrinated since childhood with teachings of German racial and cultural superiority. They had undergone the most rigorous training imaginable, yet they found themselves helpless before American technology. Witnesses reported that survivors, broken by hours of bombardment, rushed directly toward American lines, preferring immediate death to continued annihilation by shells that seemed to hunt them. Military discipline dissolved entirely among troops considered Hitler's most devoted followers. Industrial achievement of staggering proportions lay behind these proximity fuses. By December 1944, over 100 American companies had shifted production lines to manufacturing fuses. The Crosley Corporation stopped making refrigerators and converted its factories to fuse assembly. Emerson Radio halted civilian radio production and devoted its resources entirely to weapons manufacturing. Sylvania, RCA, and General Electric transformed entire complexes into proximity fuse production facilities. Quality control reached levels never before attempted in American manufacturing. Every one of the 130 individual components underwent rigorous testing. Inspectors examined every solder joint under magnification. The company selected random finished fuses and actually fired them to verify they could withstand the violent conditions of combat. Standards proved absolutely ruthless. Any component that showed even minor deviations from specifications went into the trash. The workforce, predominantly composed of women, maintained this exacting precision while working 12-hour shifts, 6 days each week. Security restrictions meant they never discovered what they were actually building. They understood only that their work mattered desperately to American victory. These workers, turning out one proximity fuse every 2 seconds around the clock, achieved a cost reduction that seemed almost miraculous. In 1942, a single fuse cost $732, which exceeded what most American workers earned in an entire year. By December 1944, mass production had brought that price down to just $18 per unit, while quality remained exceptional. This efficiency enabled the production of 22 million fuses during the entire war, with 200,000 deployed specifically during the Battle of the Bulge. General George Patton grasped the significance of proximity fuses better perhaps than any military commander. When his Third Army raced southward to break through German lines and relieve Bastogne, he wielded proximity fuses as his breakthrough weapon. His artillery commander, Brigadier General Edward Williams, created entirely new tactics specifically designed around proximity fuse capabilities. Williams developed the time-on-target concentration technique using proximity fuses, coordinating multiple artillery battalions to fire so that their shells arrived at precisely the same moment. When dozens of proximity-fused shells detonated simultaneously at the precise altitude needed for maximum effect, the destruction became virtually incomprehensible. German soldiers began referring to it as the bell toll of death. During just 1 week, from December 22nd through December 29th, Patton's Third Army unleashed 50,000 proximity-fused shells. These bombardments proved absolutely crucial in shattering German defenses and establishing the corridor that relieved Bastogne. Patton himself made his assessment quite clear, declaring that the proximity fuse had delivered the victory at the Bulge. The Battle of Elsenborn Ridge demonstrated proximity fuses at their most devastating. The 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions maintained their hold on this vital ridge against repeated assaults from the 6th SS Panzer Army, which included the fanatical 1st SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Over 3 consecutive days beginning December 17th, American gunners fired 160,000 rounds in total, approximately 40,000 of which carried proximity fuses. These proximity-fused shells, comprising just 25% of all artillery fired, produced approximately 60% of the estimated 5,000-plus German casualties. The mathematics spoke volumes. Proximity fuses multiplied American firepower by roughly 4 times. German assaults kept flowing up steep, heavily forested hillsides, only to encounter walls of shrapnel detonating overhead. Entire German companies vanished in seconds under the airbursts. Corpses piled so thickly that fresh attacking waves had to scramble across the bodies of their own fallen comrades. After 3 consecutive days of this nightmare, the German attacks finally stopped. The cream of the Waffen-SS had been broken, not by American courage or superior numbers, but by American technological superiority. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe attempted one final massive stroke with Operation Bodenplatte. 900 fighters attacked Allied airfields in a coordinated assault. Complete surprise was achieved, and many Allied aircraft were caught and destroyed on the ground. However, German pilots returning to their bases encountered a storm of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. Of 277 German aircraft destroyed that day, 172 fell to anti-aircraft guns, the vast majority using proximity fuses. The kill rates astounded military analysts on both sides. German pilots trained extensively to evade the predictable patterns of conventional anti-aircraft fire now found shells detonating with precise accuracy at the exact altitude where damage would be greatest. Already weakened, the Luftwaffe never recovered from these losses. By early January 1945, keeping the proximity fuse secret became impossible. Far too many shells had been fired across the Ardennes. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers had witnessed their effects directly. January 6th saw the War Department authorize limited disclosure of the technology. The New York Times reported the existence of a new artillery shell variety that dramatically increased the effectiveness of American guns, though the article refrained from explaining exactly how the technology functioned. German intelligence finally understood the weapon's true power, though they realized it far too late. A January 10th intelligence report from Foreign Armies West acknowledged the situation grimly. The report confirmed that the Americans possessed a radio-controlled artillery fuse that caused shells to detonate at the optimal height for killing personnel. This new weapon had inflicted severe casualties throughout the Ardennes fighting. No effective defense against it existed. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who oversaw German operations, stated plainly after the war that the proximity fuse had determined the outcome. German offensives collapsed, not due to American soldiers fighting with greater courage, though they certainly fought bravely, but because American artillery functioned as though it possessed eyes and could see German positions. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, testified that American artillery terrorized his soldiers, particularly those new shells that burst in the air. Even veterans of years of combat experienced panic when these shells detonated overhead. The numbers reveal the story with stark clarity. 200,000 proximity-fused shells fired in total, creating an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 German casualties, representing up to 20% of all German losses during the entire battle. The weapon achieved 5 to 10 times greater destructive effect compared to conventional ammunition, all without requiring forward observers and functioning perfectly during poor weather. Yet behind every casualty statistic lay profound human tragedy. German soldiers, numerous among them, just teenagers conscripted in the war's final desperate months, died in ways that previous generations of warfare had never contemplated. Shells seemed to hunt them down wherever they attempted to hide. American factory workers who built these weapons paid their own terrible price. Factory accidents occurred regularly, but were suppressed for security reasons. Workers at various facilities, including Crosley and Emerson, suffered nervous breakdowns from relentless stress and exhaustion. They manufactured instruments of unprecedented destructive capability without knowing what they had created, carrying that knowledge silently beneath official secrecy. Yet weighing moral calculations during wartime proves never simple. The Battle of the Bulge alone consumed 19,000 American lives. How many additional American soldiers would have fallen without proximity fuses? How much longer would fighting have continued? Each additional day of war meant more concentration camp prisoners waiting for liberation, more innocents murdered in German extermination facilities. Every day the conflict shortened, potentially saved thousands of imprisoned people. The proximity fuse program sparked technological advances that fundamentally transformed post-war development. Miniaturized vacuum tubes designed for fuses became the foundation for modern electronics throughout the world. Quality control methods created for fuse production became standard practice throughout American industry. The organizational systems coordinating hundreds of suppliers established patterns that later became modern supply chain management. Physicist James Van Allen applied his miniaturization knowledge to satellite instruments and later made discoveries regarding Earth's radiation belts that bear his name. Radar principles refined through the fuse program evolved into contemporary systems. The concept of autonomous sensors making independent detonation decisions became the foundation for guided missiles and eventually all modern smart weapons. This represented the first weapon capable of sensing its environment and making independent firing decisions. The revolution that began in the Ardennes forests continues across modern battlefields where technological weapons have become dominant. The Battle of the Bulge concluded January 25, 1945, with German forces retreating in complete disorder. Hitler's final offensive had destroyed approximately 100,000 German troops. American casualties reached 75,000, including 19,000 killed. The proximity fuse had proven itself not merely as a weapon, but as the element that determined victory. General Dwight Eisenhower assessed that had Germany possessed proximity fuses during the Normandy landings, the invasion might have become extraordinarily difficult, or perhaps impossible altogether. This evaluation underscores their supreme strategic importance. They represented far more than just an artillery enhancement, but rather a revolutionary technology that fundamentally altered the mathematical equations of warfare itself. German soldiers encountering proximity-fused artillery experienced something entirely unprecedented in their understanding of combat. Death arrived through shells that seemed intelligent, that could locate them regardless of cover, that transformed the atmosphere itself into a lethal zone. Their experience embodied warfare's transition into the technological age. From Colonel Clarence Luce's initial unauthorized deployment on December 16, 1944, through the methodical firing of 200,000 shells across the Ardennes, proximity fuses established that scientific innovation could deliver decisive military advantage. American industrial capacity, scientific achievement, and tactical flexibility converged to create a weapon that helped shape the war's conclusion. The proximity fuse narrative ultimately examines transformation on multiple levels. It demonstrated that industrial democracy could manufacture weapons of devastating power, that innovation could overcome numerical disadvantages, that nations commanding superior science would likely emerge victorious. These truths shaped not merely the remaining months of World War II, but the entire military structure that developed afterward. In the frozen Ardennes landscape, technological warfare arrived fully formed. Tiny radar devices mounted inside artillery shells rewrote the mathematics of destruction, permanently transforming how humanity conducts warfare. The German soldiers who died beneath proximity fused airbursts became casualties not merely of a singular battle, but of a military revolution that persists in determining how conflicts unfold across the world today.